I tried to start with the first slide, which would be how I got in touch with SLC6A1 Connect and Amber. And my strategy was to look at all my emails I ever received. And I noticed that the first email I could find was the one which I wrote to Amber. And that happened because she directly called me. She didn't write me an email. And I mean, who does that, right? So these days, and I think that is like resembling a lot of great process which has been made over the last years. So I'm presenting a weird version of science. It's basically collecting from a lot of different types of research data and trying to solve gaps of knowledge. And I hope it was very illustrative, and I hope I can show you why this type of work is really important and will hopefully lead to faster success and less risks in the future. So what do I mean with this? So I think this is a study where I'm very proud of. I know that several people from pharma are here in this room, and I always have to reiterate this. And I think it's also really important for families to know. So always people are asking, how frequent is my disease, right? So, and there are many ways to do this. And for genetic disorders, it's really challenging to understand the frequency of a disease. We call it incidence or prevalence. If you don't have systematic genetic testing, right? If everyone in the world would get genetic testing at birth, we could just look how many patients are there, like the census, like in the US or so, right? So for population estimates. But this is not possible for genetics. So fortunately, we know how frequent are mutations and how often they happen by chance. And we can do some magic with this and come to a number where we have strong belief in what the frequency of de novo variants or new mutation associated SLC6A1 disorders are in the US. And this study was published, I think, 4 or 5 years ago. And since then, I had to talk to, I think, at least 50, maybe 60, 70 pharma companies and organizations who asked, how does this work and how strong you do believe in this? And I personally could convince so far everyone, even all the mathematicians and who knows, that these numbers are solid. So, and we didn't do this only for SLC6A1, but we did this also, for more than 3,000 rare diseases. If you think about this that way, these 98 new patients per year, this is not really rare, And for me, as someone who is working on disease now since 15 years and using tons of molecular and clinical data, whatever, I think there's also no real common disease. People always do this one-to-one separation, but if you really look how and why people develop heart attack or why develop people common autism or common epilepsies, everyone has their own story, and if you look at all the biomarkers then from the MRIs to the EEG to the natural histories of the disease and all these factors which play a role, everyone is slightly different. So the only thing for rare diseases we can measure it with genetics. So, and this breakdown that there's common disease and rare disease doesn't make sense to me, and that's also, why for many of the common diseases all the drugs are failing, right? Because everyone at the end is still different, although we call them, hey, this is the common version of the disease. But at the end, it's not. We need to stratify more, and these the rare diseases, what we call today, are actually the first, the innovators, which help really to develop better drugs. So, and you look at this number, like these 98 new patients per year, right? This is only considering these spontaneous mutations, and only looking at the US. So, you're not alone. It's just a matter of better screening, and a lot of talks went into this today, and understanding the disease better. So then I feel very strong about these numbers. If you disagree with me, we can have a coffee and talk about this very hard. So I feel very motivated about this. Okay, so why do we need more data, right? So one could argue so that once you understand to some degree a problem, then things are good. For example, if we would have a therapy, which looks very promising, right, that multiple avenues might converge and one of these different approaches might be successful, why would we collect all the data because we're close to drugs, right? But at the end, when you look in the literature and also in history, always when there's a new therapy, then there's also adverse effects. Or if there is a responder, then there's also a non-responder, right? So there are many reasons why one wants to directly, before one runs into these problems, already collect a lot of data that you can then look at the data and see maybe there are patterns. And one thing is already clear, that genetic diseases are not so straightforward how you would think about this from the beginning, maybe. So, and here's just an example, even how a single monogenic disorder can actually be relatively complex, and this is why we need data. So here's, for example, like a really made-up example where we have 4 different boys, all have variants in SLC6A1, and all had their first seizure by the age of 2, just completely made up, right? So just imagine John, who had his first seizure at the age of year 2, and he was, for some reason, really lucky that he had the very best pediatrician in the world, and he got the perfect drug, which is at that time on the market, and that reduces seizures, right? That's John. So, but then, and John has clear loss of function variant. So, but then think about Joe, who was less lucky, and he received, drugs which, maybe he shouldn't have gotten at the beginning. And, think about this as a developing brain, right? You know this better than me. These are children who are growing and receive drugs which, affect how the brain works. So it took a long time until, things got a little bit better. And as we know, for people who work on epilepsy is a progressive disease. It leads to, that our brains are more synchronized, and with every seizure, they synchronize automatically a little bit more. So the longer we wait, that has an effect. So, and then we have James. James is different to John and Joe because right from the get-go had a different version of the genetic disease, because here the mutation has a less severe effect. And interestingly, also, James has some family history of brain disorders. So, and finally, we have Jim, who has also like a, let's say, milder version of the genetic defect, and he was fine. So that we have now these different configurations of children, and now we have the question, right? So imagine this like 5 years later, should they all receive the same care? Or should everyone have a different care path based on the environmental factors or based on the genetic factors? And there are other questions. Should they receive the same dosage of if their future targeted therapy, or maybe there should be differences? And what are the long-term challenges, from the drugs or maybe just in life? And we cannot at all answer these questions if we don't collect data yesterday. Okay? So I hope really that, this motivates everyone to maybe fill out some questionnaires twice or 3 times, because sooner or later they end up and come together, and we can, maybe one of these questions which you answered helps then to answer one of these questions, which we for sure will face. Everyone, at the moment, not many people spend energy on thinking about these problems because we want to have short-term goals, but at the end, once we receive the short-term, or we are successful short-term, which we will be, then we have these long-term problems or unanswered questions, and we need to be able to and be in a position to answer them. Okay, so I personally spend a lot of energy on genetics, so I have to go a little bit deeper for genetics and variant interpretation. So because what many people say is, hey, you have either a pathogenic variant, so something which causes the disease, or a genetic mutation, or you don't, right? So, but at the end, it's a little bit more complicated, and it's very important that a very skilled person looks at your genetic test result. And I come throughout my talk a little bit that we are actually advancing in research quite a bit with this. So here's just an example about a classical drug. So you give a drug, you give it enough, you have to figure that out to some degree. People have different weights. And until you're in the so-called therapeutic window. Here, the drug is working really properly, and it's not, it has an effect, but it's not having side effects. And then over time, a classical drug will wash out. So you have to give the drug again. So, and you want to be in the green zone, right? And you have to figure this out for, every child until you have clear rules. And for rare disease, it takes a while. But think about precision medicines, right? So therapies which may act in lifelong. So here you need to know where the therapeutic window is right from the get-go, or it will be hard, or we have to learn this with the first patients. So I think this is good. But one thing what is very important, what many people forget, is that we have this situation that not every variant causes the same effect. So if someone has a complete loss of function, you need to dose probably harder compared to someone who has only a partial loss of function. Okay, so, and these things need to be considered. So when we run our clinical trials, when we want to understand long-term effects of certain therapeutics, we need to have a very good understanding of the effect of the genetic variant. So when we can talk about genetic variant interpretation, we don't talk about benign or pathogenic or VUSs anymore. We talk actually about mechanism of the disease, because the drugs we are using act on mechanism, not anymore on just blinded what's going on. And it's getting complex. And so what I would really encourage you to challenge your care provider and ask them, hey, does my child have a partial loss of function or complete loss of function? And if your care provider is not able to answer that question, you might want to look for someone who is motivated to understand that question. I'm saying this provocatively because I'm a PhD, not an MD, right? So I can just say this. But seriously, this is a problem which needs to be understood and thought through. So, and there is no real answer. We can only answer with research, and research is sometimes too early to go really for medical advice. But it's important to understand the question when you consider enrolling in a clinical trial. So, but the point I want to make is, for some variants it's very obvious, and then the clinical trial question is also very obvious. Okay, so how do we solve all these problems, right? So, and here come a little bit to the science we do. So this is an example what scientists always bring when everyone is a nerd, right? So if someone talks about what is SLC6A1, some people will talk about weird generalized seizures for an hour, right? Other people will talk about GABA in every second sentence. And this is because scientists really are nerds, right? So, and the problem is that to understand the problem complex, you need to talk to another, and you need to bring all kinds of data together. And this is always this example what people bring here, like 6 blinded scientists, and they all live in their own world, and they don't understand that there's a big elephant in the room. So we have the same situation, for our research. So there are many, many people who do different kinds of research, and they need to bring the data together, and they need to meet at these meetings to come together and understand the problem as a whole. And our team has now worked with many, many scientists from all over the world, and many of them here in the room, to collect their data and to try to make sense of this as a whole. And this is a study which will be released next week in the public server, and you can read this. And it's, I think, the largest patient series ever published so far for SLC6A1 disorders. So, but you can already access all the data today. So the goal is for our, the main finding of this study is that the other studies which are currently ongoing could show that not every mutation or variant has the same strength of effect. But with also a new molecular data, we understand actually how SLC6A1 really, or the protein GAT1, looks as a whole. And what we noticed is that the position of the mutation is really correlated with the strength of the effect. That's still researchy, it's not clinically useful, but it helps us to develop the first criteria to say, hey, this is more like a very severe variant that's very close to the middle of the transporter, if you want to. And it's the mutation's getting a little bit more soft when you move away from the middle. So, but we release next week the paper, and then all the scientists can read this in detail. So, but what I'm always facing is this following situation. So I'm moderating Saturday, the special interest group genetics at the American Epilepsy Society meeting. And Sunday, I give the course, in the annual course of the biggest session at the AES, I give a talk about variant interpretation in the precision medicine part. And the problem is, we have so many genes, and and a caregiver has so little time to learn about each disorder. So, and for every gene, you need to have really broad. You need to use a lot of information to make a good interpretation and good decisions how to provide the best care. And at the moment, the only way to get to this information is you start reading the scientific literature for like hours. And literally, you have to do 10 hours or so to have a basic understanding about SLC6A1 disorders, because there's still individually not many at each center. So most doctors, like we have heard this today, they have never met someone with SLC6A1 disorder. And a lot of care which is done today is done based on intuition and experience. But if you have never met someone with that disorder, how do you get experience? You have to read about this. So, and doing this literature review is very cumbersome and takes forever. So and maybe also all the data you've identified is maybe not the best. So that's why we developed the SLC6A1 Portal to share all the data which we as a community develop to give people fast access that they can learn about the disease, and also develop educational resources that also everyone in the room here can learn about the disorders. So this is the SLC6A1 Portal. Literally, the link works. So this is a big community effort. Maybe I just go directly to the About page. Big support from the Family Foundation and many people here, and everyone who feels that they have data and they are not listed here, please come join us, collaborate with us, let's bring our data here together, that we can solve many problems. So here we have basically all. So from these 150 individuals with SLC6A1 disorders, we have the expert-curated, this is important to note, expert-curated clinical information and their genetic variants. We have here also listed basically the important publications we think are worth reading for someone who is new to this disorder. For example, you see it first time in a genetic test result, and this is important for physicians as well as for families. And you can get a quick intuition about the, clinical representation of the patients. So due to lack of time, I don't want to go too much into detail, but the website is online, and we have some basic information, but we have also like information content. I think many of you will have already seen this video what we generated about SLC6A1 disorders, and if you don't like the video, there's Arthur, and he did it, so you can complain against him. You can learn about the disorder and so on and so forth. So, but the more new part in this update, what we generated is we have now more data here in the variant analysis part. So you can actually look at your mutation, type it in here, and submit it. And you see, for example, that this specific mutation is a code for the variant, which you see in your report. We have 10 patients, and you can see a little bit what the frequency of epilepsy is, when the epilepsy typically starts, and you can do this for all possible mutations. And then you can learn also a little bit how the people look in their clinical representation, and also how people look who have variants in a very similar location in the gene, and how does that translate. And then there's also functional data. So, for example, this variant leads to round about 40% uptake, and then you can compare against other mutations at that same region or all patient variants, so you can get some agreement. And so anyway, so this is now for people who are really interested about the mutation and what the science says about this mutation or related ones. And you can even go more into detail when you go to the research part, where you then can explore, for example, mutations on their position in more detail, and can even compare this against mutations which don't cause disease, which are from reference databases, and can explore in general which regions of the protein have, for example, the greatest number of patient variants in relationship to variants which don't cause disease. So this is not something where I would typically spend now 40 minutes in explaining this thoroughly, but I don't have the time, but I'm happy to talk to you offline. And we have really also the functional data from Katie Kang in here and also from the team from Biomarin. And you can really explore where the different, so over 200 mutations have been functionally tested. So how they, cluster and where the functional effect changes. And the strongest, just as a summary, because it's also in the paper quite a bit, so the strongest change in function is observed for mutation which are near the ligand binding, so the GABA, in the transporter membrane. So that's maybe for the scientists here in this room. And you can filter the data for various information, like type of variant or which region of the protein, and then all these statistics will change here. And again, that's like a big team effort. So the overarching goal of this was really to make all the data which we in the community is aggregating, recycling it, put it together, and see if when we connect the data, that we can learn something. And I hope when we just think about this example from the beginning, that everyone is motivated to share more data, because only if we really collect all information, that we can be in a good position to answer questions we have today, prepare better clinical trials, make sure that the right patient receives the matching drug, and that the trials are successful, and that we also understand the long-term effects of the therapies. And with this, I will close. Thank you very much.